Welcome back, Deep Divers. We always love getting your requests, and this one's been popping up a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, folks are really intrigued by the world of Kamala Das, also known by her pen name, Madhavi, right?
Madhavi, that's right.
So we dug deep, like we do, and found this really insightful discussion by Dr. Jasvant Rathod.
Great source.
Really gets into why Das was, and I'm quoting the Times here from back in 2009, the mother of modern English Indian poetry. A powerful statement.
Definitely.
And that's our mission today, to explore her key themes, understand what made her such a groundbreaking, and let's be honest, sometimes controversial figure.
Dr. didn't shy away from anything.
Nope, not at all. So we're going to unpack her style, her boldness, and those personal experiences Dr. Rathod says really fueled her writing.
Sounds like a deep dive indeed. Ready to jump in.
Absolutely. Let's start with the basics, huh? Where does this all begin?
Well, Dr. Rathod makes it clear that to really grasp Das's impact, you got to start with her background. She was born in 1934, Thrissur, Kerala.
Okay, South India.
Right, but then her childhood was actually spent in Kolkata.
Kolkata, interesting. So like a multicultural upbringing, you'd say.
Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting, right? Because Dr. Rathod highlights how even though she grew up surrounded by art, her mother and uncle were writers.
Family business.
Kind of, but she felt, and this is important, ignored and unloved.
Whoa.
Yeah, so this early experience of emotional neglect, that's a foundational thing Dr. Rathod points to. You can see how it influences her later work, that longing and vulnerability in relationships. It's all there.
Makes sense.
And then another layer, as Dr. Rathod lays it out, she's married off as a teenager to an older relative.
Oh, wow.
Leads to some, emotional and sexual difficulties.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And these experiences, they become the raw material for her memoir, My Story, No Holds Barred.
It's pretty striking when you look at it all laid out like that, how those early experiences, those early hurts, really shaped her, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's like Dr. Rathod saying she took those experiences and turned them into fuel.
And she was not afraid to break with convention, not one bit.
Not in her writing, not in her life. Like, Dr. Rathod really emphasizes how different her style and the content was from, say, those romanticized love poems from the 1800s.
Oh, yeah, totally different vibe.
Huge shift. And for an Indian Hindu woman at that time, that was a bold move.
It's kind of hard to overstate that, right?
Yeah.
In that context, how significant was her choice to write about female sexuality so openly?
It was revolutionary, honestly.
Wow.
Yeah, like Dr. Rathod puts it in perspective when he looks at other female Indian poets of the time. This openness about female sexuality, no guilt, no shame. It was just unheard of.
I can only imagine how that went over.
Yeah, it gave her writing this immense power, but it also, as Dr. Rathod points out, made her an iconoclast.
Someone who breaks the rules.
Exactly. And her famous line, "Poetry does not sell in this country," that tells you a lot about the environment she was navigating.
Tough crowd.
You could say that. And then, Dr. Rathod brings up those confessional poets like Anne Sexton, Robert Lowell, and that comparison really highlights how personal, how unflinching her work was. It was all laid bare.
No filter. So how did people react to this honesty?
Well, Dr. Rathod argues that it had a huge impact. Like, he emphasizes how Das directly challenged, and I'm quoting him here, the hypocritical veneer of man-woman relationship in Indian traditional society.
Ooh, strong words.
Yeah, this wasn't just some subtle critique. Dr. Rathod calls it a serious break from earlier poets like Toru Dutt and Sarojini Naidu.
Okay, so for those of you listening, think of it this way. She was speaking truth to power in a culture where that was pretty much unheard of.
Exactly.
And what exactly was so different about her approach, would you say?
It wasn't just about being a woman writing, it was the specific kind of break, as Dr. Rathod analyzes it. While other female poets might have touched on certain themes, Das went there. She explored, and I'm quoting again, the universal experience of self, love, despair, anguish, failure, and disgust.
Heavy stuff.
But the key is how she filtered it all through, as Dr. Rathod puts it, a feminine Indian awareness. It was raw, real, and deeply rooted in her cultural context.
Now, it seems like this directness, this unflinching look at raw emotion could be pretty provocative for some people, no?
Absolutely. And Dr. Rathod even goes so far as to call her the Indian Monroe, comparing her to Marilyn Monroe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he suggests that Das's writing had a similar effect, titillating, arousing, with what he calls an air of exotica. And he points to her poem Introduction as a prime example.
That's a pretty strong comparison. So she was challenging norms, pushing boundaries in multiple ways.
Definitely. It wasn't just about the shock value, though. Dr. Rathod also emphasizes how her work delved into the struggle for power and autonomy by the women poets, as he puts it.
Okay, so she was advocating for women's rights, you'd say.
Absolutely. He argues that her female characters weren't passive. They were intelligent, self-aware, confident, and integrated, living life on their own terms. And he even brings up the Old Playhouse and other poems, specifically that image of a seemingly irresponsible female protagonist and the sea, suggesting it represents this recurring theme of women seeking freedom and agency.
It sounds like she really wasn't afraid to shake things up.
Not at all. Like, Dr. Rathod makes this point. Never before had any woman in India dared to describe so distinctly about the physicality or longing of a woman as Kamala Das.
That's
It was unprecedented, and you can imagine how that hit Indian society at the time.
like an earthquake.
Exactly. He says her revelation has made the whole Indian society dazed and awesome. And it's this, the forceful expression of the problems of women, as he puts it, by citing her own style. And he probably meant to say style here, referring to her personal style and experiences.
Well, yeah, her own life.
Right. That's what made her such a daring and controversial poet. And, for context, Dr. Rathod also mentions her conversion to Islam later in life, taking the name Suraya Begum. That adds another layer of complexity. Right?
It's a lot to unpack. So let's break down some of those key themes Dr. Rathod identifies, shall we? He starts with love and sexuality, which seems pretty central to her work, no?
Oh, absolutely. That's probably the most recognizable aspect, like Dr. Rathod says. Her exploration of these themes, it was directly challenging those conservative Indian norms. She wrote about physical and emotional intimacy, everything from ecstasy to vulnerability, the pain of it all.
Real raw stuff.
In poems like The Sunshine Cat and The Freaks, Dr. Rathod really digs into those. He says they show the complexities of desire, unrequited love, that longing for connection. And remember, these weren't just abstract ideas for her. They were rooted in her personal experiences.
Giving it that extra punch.
Exactly, an authenticity that really resonated with readers, sometimes shocked them, but they couldn't ignore it.
So powerful. Another big theme Dr. Rathod points out is the female experience in gender inequality. Was that something she wove throughout her work?
Constantly, yeah. Dr. Rathod really emphasizes that the struggles of women in a patriarchal society, that's at the core of her poetry. She critiqued the limitations, the lack of agency, those societal expectations placed on women. And he points to an introduction as a prime example. It's where she asserts her right to self-expression, challenges those limitations head on, showing women actively seeking autonomy and freedom.
Like a call to arms, almost.
In a way, yeah. Not just reflecting the marginalization, but actively pushing for equality and empowerment.
And it makes sense that this fight for autonomy would tie into the theme of identity and self-discovery, right? Like Dr. Rathod suggests, it seems Das was constantly wrestling with those societal expectations versus her own individuality.
It's a constant tension in her work. He calls it a recurring motif. The struggle to reconcile what society demands of a woman versus her own desire to be herself. And those feelings of alienation that come with trying to find your own voice in a traditional society, that's huge. He highlights my story again as a key example of this, how she navigates being a woman, a wife, a mother, a writer, and still trying to define herself on her own terms.
So many roles to juggle.
Exactly, and never losing sight of that core self.
Now, this term keeps popping up in Dr. Rathod's analysis, confessional and autobiographical elements. What's he getting at there?
It's all about her style, really. Dr. Rathod argues that this confessional approach, drawing so heavily on her own life, was key to the connection she built with readers. By writing in the first person, exposing her vulnerabilities, desires, fears, she made it real, relatable.
You feel like you know her.
Yeah, and those deeply personal themes, love, loss, betrayal, they became universal because she was so honest, so open about her own experience.
It's interesting that later in her life, after converting to Islam, the theme of spirituality and the quest for meaning became more prominent, as Dr. Rathod mentions.
Right, he highlights that shift. In those later works, there's this focus on spirituality, searching for something beyond the material world. It's like she was wrestling with those worldly desires she'd explored before and this newfound longing for inner peace, It shows how her perspective kept evolving.
Always growing. Now let's talk about her language. Writing in both English and Malayalam, that must have influenced her work quite a bit.
It's more than just being bilingual, though, as Dr. Rathod explains. He points out how her use of English, often infused with Indian imagery and idioms, was a way of challenging those linguistic norms, saying, hey, Indian English is a valid literary medium.
Making a statement.
Right, and through her language choices, her themes, she was also critiquing cultural hierarchies, celebrating that post-colonial identity.
A lot going on beneath the surface.
Layers, always layers with DOS.
One last theme Dr. Rathod mentions, nature and the body. What is the significance there?
He's talking about her use of imagery, mostly. She drew a lot from nature, landscapes, seasons, those kinds of things, using them as metaphors for her emotional and physical experiences.
Painting a picture with words.
Exactly. And then the female body itself becomes a recurring motif, symbolizing pleasure, pain, freedom, confinement, all of it. And by depicting the body so frankly, so unapologetically, she challenged societal taboos. It's like she was saying, this is a part of who we are, it's important, and we're not going to shy away from it.
Bold, for sure. Okay, so Dr. Rathod also digs into some specific works by Das. Let's start with an introduction. Sounds like he considers this poem pretty important.
Yeah, he frames it almost like her manifesto. It's where she really lays out her poetic identity and her defiance of those societal expectations. Like, right from the start, she asserts her right to speak, points out her multilingual background, her choice to write in English, even though some people criticized her for it. And then that declaration, I am Indian, very brown, born in Malabar. It's like she's rooting herself in her culture, but also rejecting the limitations it tries to impose on her as a woman.
She's claiming her space.
Absolutely. And the poem goes on to critique those patriarchal norms, her struggles with gender roles, marriage, that pressure to conform, and that line, I too call myself I. It's all about that desire for freedom, for individuality against all odds.
So defiant.
It's a powerful exploration of that tension between her public and private selves, culminating in her embracing her identity as a poet, a woman who won't be contained by tradition.
And then there's her autobiography, My Story. We touched on it a bit, but it sounds like a pretty controversial piece, according to Dr. Rathod.
Oh, hugely controversial at the time. And as the title suggests, it's her life story, from childhood to adulthood, and she holds nothing back. She writes about love, marriage, sexuality, her journey as a writer. It's all there. And her honesty about her personal relationships, the affairs, her disillusionment with marriage, it really shocked people.
I bet.
But at the same time, she got a lot of praise for being so unflinchingly honest. And beyond the personal stuff, it's also a powerful critique of patriarchy, how those structures limit women's freedom. She reflects on her own struggles, trying to reconcile her passionate nature with those rigid societal expectations, searching for emotional and sexual fulfillment.
A lot to take in.
It is. And it's considered a seminal work in Indian feminist literature for a reason. It's this bold exploration of female desire and autonomy, which was groundbreaking. And Dr. Rathod also reminds us that it touches on her spiritual journey, her conversion to Islam, adding another layer of complexity to her search for identity and meaning.
The Old Playhouse. That's a poem with a pretty strong central metaphor, right?
Oh, yeah. In that poem, the dilapidated playhouse becomes a symbol of her failed marriage, the emotional imprisonment she felt. It reflects those feelings of suffocation, that loss of self, being reduced to an object of desire.
That's a tough image.
And there's this line, you plan to tame a swallow, to hold her in the long summer of your love, which really gets at that controlling aspect, trying to stifle her individuality. And the decay of the playhouse mirrors the decay of the marriage.
Sad but powerful.
It is. It's like a lament for the freedom she's lost, both creatively and emotionally. A critique of traditional marriage, how it can crush a woman's identity, her aspirations.
The Sunshine Cat. That's another one that seems to deal with the darker side of relationships, wouldn't you say?
It delves into love, betrayal, the aftermath of emotional manipulation, and the Sunshine Cat itself. That image is so perfect. It's alluring on the surface, but ultimately destructive.
Deceptive.
Exactly. So you have this woman seduced and abandoned by this man of no fortune, left broken emotionally, physically, and the imagery Das uses, contrasting that warmth of the Sunshine Cat with her broken body, it really drives home the pain, the disillusionment.
You really feel for her.
And it also points to those societal double standards, how men can pursue fleeting pleasures while women are left to deal with the consequences. It ends on such a despairing note, highlighting the lasting damage of betrayal.
And finally, The Freaks. Dr. Rathod suggests this one explores a different kind of disconnect, right?
Yeah, this one's about unrequited love and emotional alienation, even within a relationship. You have these two lovers who are physically close but emotionally distant. Their interactions are described as mechanical, lacking any warmth. And the imagery Das uses is stark. He talks, turning a sun-stained cheek to me, his mouth, a dark cavern where stalactites of uneven teeth gleam.
Almost grotesque.
Right, it emphasizes that lack of intimacy, that estrangement, and the title itself, The Freaks, suggests they're outsiders, maybe unable to fit into those societal norms of love.
They don't belong.
Exactly.
Right.
So it explores that longing for connection, being trapped in a superficial encounter, and the tone is very melancholy, reflecting that universal feeling of disconnection that can happen even in close relationships.
It's been a journey, diving into the world of Kamala Das through Dr. Rathod's analysis. To sum it all up, her confessional style, her exploration of love, sexuality, identity, the female experience, all within a patriarchal society, it was revolutionary.
Groundbreaking, absolutely. As Dr. Rathod makes clear, she was a trailblazer. Her willingness to voice those often unspoken struggles of women, it was unheard of at the time. She took her personal experiences and turned them into a powerful critique of societal norms, championing personal freedom. Her impact is still felt today.
So as we wrap up, it really makes you think, how have societal expectations around relationships and identity changed since her time? In what ways does her voice still resonate with us, challenge us today? Are there modern-day figures pushing boundaries in similar ways, exploring those personal truths and societal constraints through their art? It's something to ponder, to explore further. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.